This is RTE Radio 1, where it's time now for us to join John Bowman.
Good morning and welcome to this new archive series, Bowman Sunday Morning, broadcast every Sunday after the 8 o'clock news at this time. This morning, more on the history of radio to mark the 80th anniversary of the station. Sport on radio in the early days, the fascination with what became known as a running commentary, Micheál O'Hare's career, how he began, and how 2RN was first in the field with running commentary in 1927. Austin Clarke as a broadcaster, and more from Sean McRaman on the pioneering years with Seamus Ennis and the mobile recording unit. Among the early achievements of radio broadcasting was the access it gave to listeners throughout the country for news of sport. And a new broadcasting skill was introduced, what was called a running commentary on a sports event.
The sports commentary is, of course, one of the distinctive arts of broadcasting.
The poet Robord the Farracoin, a senior administrator in Radio Éireann.
First developed in radio, naturally, and very early in Ireland. I don't need to tell anyone who has listened to our commentators how difficult an art it is. I am lost in admiration at the way and at the speed with which commentators on football or hurling or whatever are able to identify individual players instantly and keep the flow of speech, feeding the listener and giving him the excitement.
Philip Green, himself a distinguished commentator on soccer and on athletics, in a documentary on the history of sports broadcasting on radio, mentioned how the early station 2RN had made history.
And then came the big breakthrough, the first ever live outside broadcast, not only in Ireland, but as it turned out, in Europe and the whole Eastern Hemisphere. You see, because of restrictive clauses in their agreements with the news agencies, the BBC were prohibited from broadcasting live commentaries on open-air events until 1927. And so 2RN took the honours of being first in the field in a field commentary situation. The match was the All-Ireland hurling semi-final at Croke Park. The date, the 29th of August 1926. The teams Kilkenny versus Galway, and the young technician assigned to duty on this historic day was Jimmy Mahan.
We had the old type microphone. It was in around 27 or 28 pounds in weight. A round Sykes, they call it. I believe they have it still here in the museum, I don't know. But however, that was parked out on the touchline, if you follow me, on a tripod with a little small hole in the front for the talking to. And underneath were 4 very big batteries. They were ship's batteries, I think, to polarise it. And there was always a great danger that that would be knocked over, but it never was in Croke Park. I was on the touchline. There was somebody else inside under the stand, but they were all around us. It was a great novelty in those days. Of course, it was a great novelty for us too, I can assure you.
The commentator who made history was a famous Cork man who wrote under the pen name Carberry, P.D. Meegan. One of his successors, Eamon de Barra, is talking about him in this archive interview.
When I came back from London in 1929, the late Paddy Meegan, God rest him, was doing the running commentaries of GAA games at the time, and Paddy Meegan was a great GAA reporter. He had been a hurler himself, and his brother Mick was captain of the Cork 1911 All-Ireland football team. And he was the GAA correspondent for the Irish Times. He also wrote an article every week in the Cork Weekly Examiner, Carberry's column. But he was a very good commentator. And I happened to come back from London. I got a job for a while in Ford's in Cork on the export department there. And the representative of the Russian government at that time was an Italian engineer named Pediani. Pediani made what we called at that time a wireless set. And it had a big wooden frame, I remember well. It was about 3 feet high, and at that time you had to have a wet battery and a dry battery. And he told me the parts cost him £25. And he sold me the set when he was recalled to London for £5. I used to have the set on Sundays when Carberry would be broadcasting, say, a Munster final. And I'd have to put it out in the garden and let the crowd gather. And at that time, I always remember when Carberry would give an exciting bit of commentary, how the crowd would cheer, especially if it was a Cork goal. And while they were looking at the box. But it was the only set in the neighbourhood at the time, and it was a great novelty at that time. Sport was the one item of radio or whatever way you pronounce it, wireless items at that time, well, commentaries on sport. There was a tremendous interest in sport, and of course people at that time didn't read newspapers to the extent they do now. And the programs, especially the live programs of matches, very exciting.
There were critics, of course, of Radio Éireann commentators. Know-alls who knew how it should be done.
Independent, 14th of August, 33. Enthusiast Ardra writes, could some improvement be made on the running commentary on Gaelic matches? Many of us here in the north are very interested in Gaelic matches and can only hope with the aid of a good commentary to visualize the play. Can't we have announced to us the flight of the ball in its principal movements, movements that count in the game? Can't we be told who plays the ball, to what side frees, etc. are given, who takes them, and the result?
A recurring theme in the early history of broadcasting is the parsimony of the Department of Posts and Telegraphs, and by extension of the Department of Finance. They queried all expenditure. And when it came to an All-Ireland final being showcased in New York after the war, Micheál O'Hare expected to be sent as the commentator. But the minister of the day, Erskine Childers, thought this expenditure too great. He had another commentator in mind.
There was disharmony in 1951 when the GAA National League finals were played in New York, but Micheál O'Hare was not sent there as commentator. Instead, to save expense, an American who did public address announcements over there was recruited. His name, Lefty Devine. The broadcast, total disaster, an outcry followed.
Radio Review, 4th of October 51, by OGD. The first job of a commentator is to tell his listeners what is going on. His second, to relay, and sometimes to create, the excitement of what is going on. And his third, to keep talking at all costs. Mr. Devine did none of these things. Instead, he gave us a mass of irrelevant details, interpolated into a commentary that will be memorable chiefly for the endless chain of pauses and his willful, wanton wandering from the point of play. It was, in fact, so bad that one cannot help wondering on whose authority or on what recommendations Radio Éireann made this appointment. Or did Mr. Devine's audition promise better things?
We would have liked to have sent Micheál O'Hare over, but the minister at the time, it was Mr. Childers, I think, and he suggested another commentator whom he'd heard of in New York, that was Lefty Devine. So we settled for that. I don't think it was a very successful choice, and I regretted it.
On the morning of the match, it dawned on me, if this fella happens to be good, I'm going to seem the greatest fool that ever was. And without being catty or anything like that, the match wasn't on 5 minutes that night, and I was dancing, the only time I ever danced in my life, on top of a table with sheer joy, because the gamble of saving the few bob had kicked back a little bit. And I do feel that that particular night did Micheál O'Hare more good, although he was at home. And it got a lot of publicity after the match. And I will never forget a line in an article which was written by Mitchell Cogley on the subject, and the article wound up with the line, O'Hare is human to forgive Devine.
Darling is trying to go through. His way is blocked. Paddy Barry's got up to help him. Kwan is taking a shot to goal. It's a goal, but it looks like too late for Cork. Mick Kwan, the scorer in the dying moments. Mick Kwan, the scorer of that one, making it 4-13 to 4-11. Time ticking away now. Out comes the puck out, and there goes the final whistle, and Tipperary have beaten Cork by 2 points.
The first sports event I remember is an eyewitness account of the Kilkenny-Tipperary All-Ireland hurling final in Killarney. And it was Sean O'Callaghan was giving the broadcast. It was September 1937 in Conlon's in Taggart in Spidale.
Micheál O'Brien graphically recalls the magic of listening to radio commentary. Communally.
I think there were only four sets in the parish at the time. The doctor or the master or the parish priest, but we wouldn't go to those houses, of course. I mean, this was an open house of kind of for everybody. Well, that was my first experience of radio, and I thought it was wonderful.
And my first broadcast was to be the 14th of August in Mullingar between the Ulster champions Monaghan and the Connacht champions Galway. And indeed, to freshen myself up on the Monaghan team, I'd gone up to see the Ulster final. That was between Monaghan and Armagh, and a tough game it was too.
He came to the Ulster final, obviously to meet the people about whom he'd be speaking in the All-Ireland semi-final, which was going to be the first match that he would broadcast.
The players were impressed by O'Hare's approach to his homework.
And I remember him quite well as a young, well-set-up young fellow. I think he had just left school. He must have been only around about 18 years of age. We were introduced to him. I little thought at that time that this person was destined to become the voice of the GAA and probably the best-known voice on Radio Air for the next 40 or 50 years. I can see him in front of me even to this day. And I can see him now as I say, a young schoolboy, or just an ex-schoolboy, and fairly well set up, with a rather angelic-looking face. And I think he had curly hair and a smiling face now, much the same as he has today, as a matter of fact. And as I say, I didn't think that in years to come he would be the best known person that was ever on Irish radio.
I was very nervous. I was anxious. I had, as I always do, I had done an awful lot of homework. I had checked on the players. I went to the hotels to see them, and then came along to the ground where there was a broadcasting box, and went into the box. It was just room enough for myself and my father, who struck me to be in an even more nervous state than I was. He sat outside, and over in a kind of a watchman's hut about 30-40 yards away was Jimmy Mahan, who was the Radio Airden technician.
He looked to me like an overgrown schoolboy or something like that. He was very good for a young fella just out of school, as I thought, as far as I remember him then. And he was exceptionally good. And at half-time, he was going very well, and at half-time I passed him up a note. As far as I remember, it was on an old cigarette packet or something like that. I don't know whether I had paper or not, to tell him that he was doing very well and keep it up.
I got word from Jimmy of 2 minutes to go, and then 1 minute to go, and then you're on the air, and off I went. And I tried to describe as best I could what was happening on the field.
And in fact, it was quite close up until probably halfway through the second half, when John Burke, I think it was, took a 50 for Galway, and the ball landed in the back of our net, having beaten everybody, and that about finished the match. But from there on, the overall superiority of Galway became more evident. But from listening to Micheál O'Hare myself in subsequent years, I would say that he still kept the excitement going in the match. He was the kind of a person who generated and communicated excitement, whether the excitement was there or not.
It was an exciting game in which the Galway men eventually took over and eventually won. And during the game, I tried, as ever, to pick out some personalities that were there, and lo and behold, I see Joe Cahan, the Kerry full-back, as a linesman. It was a natural thing to say, and there, doing the line, is the Kerry full-back, and no doubt watching these players, he might be coming up against them again. His name, of course, Joe Cahan.
I had been on leave from the civil service, and it had expired a week previously, but I got an extension. I got a medical certificate which certified that I was practically at death's door, you see. So anyway, I went up to Mullingar, and somebody asked me would I do sidelineman. I said, sure, why not? No sweat. So I did that, and I returned to the civil service, I think, the following Tuesday. And what members of the senior officers of the civil service descended on me, how in the name of God could I submit a certificate which said I was at death's door and find myself running up down the sideline in Mullingar? So Mr. O'Hare very nearly got me fired from the civil service on that account. I think I talked my way out of it. I had to.
A new voice had arrived in Irish broadcasting. Micheál O'Brien followed O'Hare's career, but he never forgot his first impression.
We went up anyway, went up to Conlon's again. Crowd, it was an open house, door open, and went in and into the parlours, as they call it. It was crowded. And a young voice came on on the radio, you see. We had never heard before. We didn't hear anything that was going to be a new person on, because we hadn't read the papers. Like, I mean, it was 14th of August, and as I said, and this young voice came on, and everybody kind of wondered, who's this fella, you see. He gave his name, but it didn't mean anything to us. Micheál O'Hare didn't mean a thing to us. I'm sure there was praise. He was only a young kid, 16 years of age, which we all know now, but we didn't know then. And next thing, the first thing he gave us the score of the minor. That's the call, we were badly beaten by Kerry. And the people were all staring at each other. And Galway started off. It was tight enough going, you know. We were all kind of mad for Galway to win, naturally. And things were going very well for us, but on occasions, there were, one time we were leading by 4 points at half-time, and then 10 points, but Monaghan came back at us. And the reaction, and this commentary, you know, like, I mean, he knew everything, little details he gave us that we never got before. Like we know now that he was the man that, he must have done his homework, you see, that he knew everything about every player and their background, and how many county champions they had, and many railway cups, and what everybody was. We were spellbound by this man this day, anyway. It was my wish from there to see Croke Park, to see two teams playing even, you know. And I anyway, the 13th of August, 1939, I cycled in on a Sunday morning. I met my sister in Galway. She was in Crossdane, yeah? And I got mass, got the train to Dublin, and my fare was 4 and 6pence. My brother met me, and he brought me to Croke Park. And, of course, Kerry and Mayo were playing. Galway wasn't playing. Kerry and Mayo playing All-Ireland semi-final. I was kind of disappointed in the game. But I wasn't watching the game as much as I was watching the surroundings. You see, Micheál O'Hare's box, and the little Hogan stand, and the long stand, and the little stand at the right-hand side. This was the Cusack stand. Now, we were under the Cusack stand, you see, and as you know, it was built in 37, maybe 36, because the All-Ireland hurling final was played in Killarney. They couldn't play it in Croke Park that year because they were building the Cusack stand. And it's the same, you see, because that's what I mean about the O'Hare. Like, I mean, it was young. It was every young fella's dream, and old people to play or to see Croke Park.
Good morning and welcome to this week's programme. September being the month for All-Ireland Finals, a special edition on Gaelic games from the archives. In this morning's programme, Brendan Behan as a boy, minding the countrymen's bicycles at Croke Park. Maureen Potter on her memories of Croke Park finals. Memories too from the 1896 finals, and Micheál O'Hare on his broadcasting career on radio. Over 50 years ago, in 1951, Brendan Behan gave this radio talk. He entitled it On the North Side, and it gives some indication of the impact of All-Ireland finals and other big Croke Park occasions, the impact they had on local children in Dublin who were not followers of Gaelic games.
At an All-Ireland final, we made a bit, minding bikes for the countrymen. Small kids didn't get a bike pitch, but we'd go up to a countryman in a car and say to him, "Miss Mark, give us a few makes and I'll mind the balance of your tires." Sometimes they were decent enough, but sometimes they'd say, "Go on out of that, my valves can look after themselves." He'd know all about that after the match when he wanted to drive home to Mayo or wherever he come from. We went mostly to Tolka Park or Dalymount ourselves. Sometimes we went to Croker, to the hurling to see O'Toole's. We got broken hurleys during the matches. We played in the street with them, or with a cricket bat, or anything you would find. After in All-Ireland, we'd nearly all have half a stick anyway. I played with a stick that had been thrown away by Lowry Marr. We never played Gaelic and knew nothing about it, but we followed our own team, NCR-AFC, North Circular Road Association Football Club, all over the place. To the Thatch, where Larkfield Housing Scheme is now, to Windy Arbour or the 15 Acres to cheer them against Mayville or Bendigo or Waterford Celtic. Waterford Celtic had nothing to do with Waterford. except they were from Waterford Street. We knew all about Matthews and Rovers, and Larry Shavey, and Crongy John, and Jimmy, his brother, and Harry Cannon, and Paddy Moore, the Lord of Mercy on them all. And even the stars of English soccer, Alec James, Hugh Fallout in Derby County, Hapgood and Baston. But the only Gaelic footballer I ever heard discussed at our street, except for Ned McCann, whom we all knew, was John Joe Shee of Tralee. During the late 20s and the great matches of Kildare and Kerry, we cheered strangely enough for Kerry. Kildare being next door to us, we neither realised nor considered. The country was the country to us, and it started where the tram tracks ended.
Brendan Behan from a broadcast in 1951 entitled On the North Side. Next from the series This Game Is Not Over Yet, a series by Ian Corr on the career of the great broadcaster Micheál O'Hare. Some extracts. This from the last programme, which took the form of an interview with Micheál O'Hare in 1984. Sean O'Sheacoin, in introducing the interview, which was with another commentator, Micheál O'Mara Hertig, mentioned that Micheál O'Hare had been broadcasting from the late 1930s. So he'd been on air in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s.
Micheál, Sean mentioned 6 decades there. Does it seem that long to you?
It doesn't. Of course, it is 6 decades, but, you know, it was late in the 30s, and now it's early in the 80s.
Still early in the 80s.
It's long, but not as long as the 6 decades it leads you to believe.
Well, then and now, is the game completely different now? People talk about all the taken place. Have they really taken place?
I think they have. And there's one question regarding that puzzles the last few years in particular. Where is ground hurling gone to? Once upon a time, one of the glories of looking at a hurling match was to see players double on the ball on the ground, and maybe 3 players that hit it from one end of the field to the other, very little picking and poking. But this year now, in the championships, and we've had some great games like Cork and Tipperary and Kilkenny and Wexford in particular, somehow the ground hurling was missing. I know Offaly are playing a certain amount of it, and that might be part of the reason they're where they are. But I would certainly long for the day when ground hurling had come back.
Later in this conversation, Micheál O'Hare was asked about his preference between hurling and Gaelic football.
Oh yes, definite preference. I love hurling. I think there's no game, no sport in the world like hurling, and I much prefer it to Gaelic football. I played a little bit of hurling many years ago, and I never played a football match in my life, but I did play a fair bit of hurling. I think hurling, with its speed, its science, and somehow an atmosphere that even a bad hurling game can create, I think it's something special.
And of course your father had a very special interest in hurling.
Yes, my father had the distinction of training the only Clare team that ever won in All Ireland. That was in 1914. And, well, I grew up in a house where stories of the 1914 team and the various aspects of hurling, well, we had it for breakfast, for dinner and for tea. Something that isn't often mentioned about my late father was that in 1927 he was brought down to train the Leitrim football team, who won a Connacht championship and played Kerry in Tuam in the All-Ireland football semi-final and lost by either 1 or 2 points.
And he wasn't called a Supremo then?
He wasn't. He was the fellow with the cap.
Yeah.
Often said that Micheál O'Hare made a game more exciting for the listeners than it was for the spectators at the match. So this next point will come as no surprise.
I also have an affection for the player that electrifies the crowd. The player that when he gets the ball, no matter how dull the game may be, but every time he gets the ball, the crowd seem to rise and they expect something. In modern terms, the likes of Pat Spillane or Barney Rock.
Players coming to you with unusual requests before a game or after a game?
On a number of occasions there have been players who had relatives who were ill, and they would say, if by any chance I get hurt, don't say that I'm hurt. I know it sounds a very simple thing, but you can see from their point of view that it could be a very serious thing. Maybe somebody at death's door and they hear that the son or the husband has gone down and badly injured. That's why on radio I never make a meal of an injury. I don't think it's fair to people at home, and it's not doing any good to anybody. It was something that when I started off, before I did my first broadcast, it was recommended to me by a priest friend of mine, Monsignor Glennon, that I would write to Tommy Woodruff, who then was the top broadcaster, sports broadcaster in the BBC. He was a brother of a Jesuit, Father Woodruff, who edited The Tablet. And I wrote to Tommy Woodruff telling him I was a young fellow starting off, and had he any advice for me and all the rest. And he wrote back, and he said that unfortunately you can't rehearse a commentary, but if you can lock yourself in the bathroom, you can talk to yourself to do an opening or something like that, and people won't think you're gone bananas. Another thing that he said to me was that remember not to alarm the mother and father or the financier, as they say, of a player, that it really does nothing. And, you know, I know people who are sticklers for sensationalism and the like wouldn't agree with that in modern times, but, you know, there's an awful lot of solid sense to it.
You still hold on to that philosophy?
I still, pretty well. You know, I don't think that it does anybody any good to say that so-and-so is being carried off with a split skull or something like that, you know. It doesn't. The same thing goes with racing. It doesn't do anyone any good. Let them find out when it's all over.
Recently I looked upon a list of sayings or missayings that commentators had. I didn't see your name listed or any saying from you. Can you remember any famous mistake you made or something?
Micheál, there's one, and I've been throwing around in my mind for the last week whether or not I should tell it, but this is 1984. There was a hurler playing for Cork called Alan Lottie. And Alan was a very good hurler, and one day he was playing against Kilkenny in Croke Park, and it was a very warm day, and the pace was terrific, and halfway through the second half, Alan threw off his boots, and about 5 minutes later he threw off his socks. And he goes for a ball and puts the hand up, grabs the ball, and as he does so, his stick is knocked out of his hand. So here I'm going, and there he is out there, Alan Lottie. He may be bootless, he may be sockless, he may be stickless, but he's not ballless. The reaction was what you would expect. I got several letters from people telling me how good it was not to castrate poor Alan.
Parish priest.
Parish priest, yes.
Any other one? Or was that the one and only?
That was one. Anyhow, I'm sure there were other ones, but that was one.
And here's another. This time the blooper is from Micheál O'Murrah himself. And this comes from Brendan Balp's audiophile bloopers in 1992.
Carney in possession, but again the referee orders the kick out to be retaken. He hadn't noted the name of the Castle Island substitute who came on, and now we have a problem that the man that has come on is number 8, and number 8 on the programme is A.N. Other.
Micheál O'Murrah. Next, from his series Canal People in 1997, Pat Feely spoke to Peter Clark about the famous Canal End in Croke Park. The canal was there before the sports ground. Pat Feely.
It's a long, long way from Clare to here. The words of the song tell us. It seems a long way too from Leitrim village to the Royal Canal at Croke Park. But the Leitrim senior footballers made the journey a few years back, much to the excitement of their supporters. We now end this programme as we began, on the same black, bleak, frosty day, looking across the grey water of the Royal Canal at what used to be a familiar sight.
We're looking here, Peter Clark, at what used to be a very familiar sight, the canal end in Croke Park. But to my eyes, and at least, it's no longer familiar. It looks quite different.
It is indeed, but the canal end still exists. We're looking back west along the canal, and we're looking at the side of Croke Park. Now, of course, Croke Park is there not as long as the canal, because in 1870 it was known as the City and Suburban Sports Ground, but more generally known as the Joneses Road Sports Ground. It was one time used as a racetrack, as a cycle track, and it was hired out for various sporting activities, for boxing, for athletics, and for ladies' football. And the GAA used it quite frequently. They hired it, and in 1896 they held the 2 All-Ireland finals there. And there was 14 acres originally in the site, and in the Belvedere, the Jesuits in Belvedere bought 4 acres of it in 1910, and the GAA bought the remaining 10 acres of it for £3,500. But it's a fine sports stadium, and I don't think there's anybody who's ever listened or watched a match or, of course, attended Croke Park that doesn't know the famous Canal End.
We've gone from the Royal Canal to the Shannon Erin Waterway and back again to the Canal End of Croke Park. One place in Dublin where all countrymen feel at home sometime. Russ in Orbe.
Pat Feely. And the only trace I have found of the 1896 All-Ireland finals mentioned there by Peter Clark, the only trace in the archives, are these reminiscences about the 1896 finals from Provincial News Roundup, first broadcast in 1959.
I have here with me 82 years old Mr. Hugh Dygan of Cormac Street, Tullamore, who is Offaly's oldest champion footballer and is indeed a grand old man of Gaeldom in Offaly. He has 5 Offaly senior football championships, and I now ask him to tell us something about those memorable games.
Well, the most memorable game, I think, was in 97 against Shotton.
Well, now, you also played against Wicklow in 1896 in Croke Park.
Yes.
Well, now, will you tell us something about that game?
Well, we were leading that much up to the last quarter, but our supporters left the field. Thinking we couldn't be beat.
You couldn't be beat. The unbeatables, in other words.
Well, we were beaten by 2 points after.
Yeah, the years that you won the championship medals were in 1896, 97, 98, and 99, and not one. Well, now, are there any of your old colleagues still living?
Well, except in America. The captain may be alive, James Reynolds.
James Reynolds.
Yes. And there's a P.J. Hayden. He could be alive.
Yes.
And there could be a Tom Rillans in Scotland.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Dygan, for telling us about your exploits. And now we have also here Mr. Richard Barry, home from New York, who was an Offaly hurler in his younger days too. So we'll ask Mr. Barry to tell us something about the games he played before emigrating.
We started a hurling team in Tullamore in connection with the Ballinamere hurling team. And they went on to win the championship of Offaly shortly afterwards, after I left for America.
And what year was that?
That was in 1904. When I was in America, I started a hurling team in Torrington, Connecticut, and kept it up for several years there. And the war came along and broke up the team. And then I had another team in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And the war broke up most of those teams, and they never come back again. Although they have a big team in Bridgeport at the present time.
Yes, and after all that then, you're a staunch supporter of the games now out in New York, and I suppose you'll be rooting for the New York boys in the St. Brendan's Cup match.
I'll be rooting for them, yes. I'll be rooting for Tullamore tomorrow.
Provincial News Roundup. And next, from the archives from the series Maureen Potter Looks Back, here is Maureen Potter talking about Kevin Moran, who had the distinction of winning an All-Ireland medal at Croke Park and a cup final medal for soccer at Wembley. Maureen Potter.
Kevin Moran got me into trouble too. I better rephrase that. When Kevin was sent off during the cup final between Man United and Everton, it caused quite a fuss. Éanna Brophy had an idea to do a parody on it based on the old song Kevin Barry, which is, of course, an ancient traditional air. We enlarged on Éanna's initial draft and became a great favourite in cabaret. As a matter of fact, audiences used to send up requests to say, do Kevin Moran. Some people thought I was making fun of Kevin Barry, but he was a young man fond of sports, and I'm sure he would have enjoyed it too. Here's an extract from the cabaret performance featuring Kevin Moran.
In Wembley Stadium one May evening, shortly after 3:30, Kevin Moran was the victim of a British referee. Just a lad from lovely Drivna, playing far across the sea. Even when he played for Dublin, Kevin wouldn't hurt a flea. But that man who blew the whistle gave our hopes an awful blow when he pointed to the sideline. Heaven more and shouted no. Frank Staple had to calm him, and united we all sighed. Referee, I bet your father was a bloody black and tan. Another martyr for out Ireland, another mock against the crown. Lads like Kevin may be sent off, but you won't keep their spirits down. Kevin Morton got his medal, but not for the match, you see, for resisting the temptation to choke an Evan
Kevin must be the only man who has an All-Ireland medal and a Cup final medal. I'm probably the only woman who ever threw in the ball to start a match in Croke Park. There's a 10-mark question for your next sports quiz. Do you remember the days when a bishop or an archbishop would be escorted out to start the All-Ireland finals? The referee would get down on one knee and kiss the bishop's ring, and the prelate threw in the football or the slither. The old hands, like Dr. Morris from Cashel, would stand well back from the players. The newcomers would stand too close and had to run like hell when the lads went for the ball. Those were the days when the band played Faith of Our Fathers before the match and everyone stood up. The first time I didn't stand up and got a vicious poke in the back from a priest's umbrella, or was it a Christian brother? Anyway, I refused to stand up in protest.
Maureen Potter. Back to Micheál O'Hare's interview with Micheál O'Murray-Hertig. Micheál O'Hare was asked about the complaints, charges that he might be biased against a particular team.
Have you been accused of bias in
sure.
commentaries or...
Now, you should know better than that. I mean, you know that yourself. I mean, there's hardly a game goes that I'm not accused of beating whoever loses. I'm never accused of winning for the team that won. I mean, that's all right. But there is a certain type of listener who listens in for his own team. And if you say something good about the others, you're again his. It's the same in all sports, and I know I've spoken with commentators in many parts of the world, and they get the same thing, that whoever loses, that commentator, he did this, that, and the other, it was his fault.
Something like the government.
Something like the government.
Does it worry you that people would say, well, you're for Dublin, you're against Dublin, you're for Kerry, you're against them, and so on?
It doesn't really worry me, because it did early on, because I wasn't used to it, if you like. But there's such a pattern of it now that it arises always from the team that has been beaten. For me, there's a job of work to be done, and I have to represent, and any commentator has to represent the followers of both teams and the neutrals, and it's up to the commentator to do the job of telling what's down in under them.
And that's also the challenge to the writer of ballads. And this next recording is one often requested in letters since I first played it on this programme some years ago. And it comes from this tradition of ballad writing about memorable football games. There are many such ballads throughout the country, many of them only known in a local area, but few in RTE's sound archives. Here's part of Brian McMahon's ballad about the 1955 All-Ireland final. It's introduced and sung by his son, Gary McMahon.
Well, this song, Pat, is written by my father, Brian McMahon, and I suppose it's one of, he must have written up to 40 or 50 ballads, and it's printed on printer's broadsheet, I suppose it was, really, and cut down to size. My father was very friendly with a printer in the store called Robert Cuthbertson, and as you might suspect, he wasn't descended from the O'Connell's Kerry. He was in fact a Scottish Presbyterian, and his father had come to North Kerry some years before that and had been a printer, and his son Robert, Bob, took it over afterwards. And my father used to be in the printer shop, I suppose, attracted to words, attracted to posters, and he got very friendly with Bob. And Bob used to often say to him when he had paper to spare, write a ballad on that. And my father would write a ballad on it, and these ballads would be sold to the travelling people or the tinkers, and they would call for them, and they would ply their wares at matches and fairs, and I think the price was usually about a penny or twopence in old money. The last one of those I remember, and who wasn't from the Kerry area at all, was poor Jimmy Heine, God be good to him, who used to go to the matches. I don't know if you ever remember him. He'd be before your time, Pat. But he used to go to Croke Park, and he was a great character there in Croke Park in later years when all the ballads sellers had disappeared. Jimmy Heine was the last, and he used to make up songs himself too and print them. So this is printed, as you see, on yellow paper, and there's a photograph at the top of it of a Kerry team in action. I don't know who they're playing, but it's in Croke Park, and you can see that quite clearly, and it says underneath it, All-Ireland football final, September the 25th, 1955, Kerry versus Dublin, Kerry's victory song. And down at the bottom it's copyright Brian McMahon, the 27th of September 1955. So it was written 2 days, within 2 days of the All-Ireland. The two Murphys played like three men, with Jerome's fair hair a-gleamin', gallant Paddy and young Cullity, Moriarty and John Joe. And Dr. Jim the Hero flew across the sea by air, oh, faith, he crashed into the square, oh, for old Kerry long ago. Like a veteran at Fowlin, our captain brave John Dowling, with O'Shea round the middle they drove back the valiant foe. And they'd roach from Knocknagoshel like the mighty Rock of Cashel, sent to Dublin hopes a-dashin' for old Kerry long ago. Oh, 'twas home we drove at dawning, jaded out and fully yawning, the victory bonfires on the hills, our hearts they set aglow. For while the reeks are standing and the holy Mount of Brandon, we will sing the praise of grand men in old Kerry long ago. Here's a health to brave Marino, yet below the gold and greeno. May the Dubs be praised in Ireland from Wexford to Mayo. They're a credit to our sireland, for we all are sons of Ireland, like the men who brought the Sam Maguire to Kerry long ago.
Well, it's going somewhere else this year, that's for certain. And that concludes this morning's programme. More voices from the archives at the same time on Saturday morning next. Thank you for listening this morning, and good morning.
The program.
Because of the 90th anniversary of Jack Lynch's birth, we included in recent weeks quite a bit about hurling, but mainly about Cork hurling. And as is well known, they're not in this year's All-Ireland final.
I thought that Christy Ring, as a hurler, had a greater repertoire than Mick Mackey had, while Mick Mackey was probably one of the most effective hurlers I ever met in my life.
And that was the verdict of Jack Lynch, although he insisted many times in that interview that it had to be a highly subjective opinion. This year's final, today's final, is between Kilkenny and Limerick. We've been listening back through the archives to hear from two of the greatest players from each county, both of them incidentally included on the GAA Team of the Millennium, as indeed Jack Lynch and Christy Ring were also included on that team. First, Jimmy Langton from Kilkenny.
How many All-Ireland medals, seniors, did you win, Jim?
Only two, really. 39 and 37.
39 was the Thunder and Lightning final, wasn't it? What's your memory of that one?
It was the day the war broke out, as you know, and the Thunder and Lightning that fell the same day just came down in buckets. Of course, it was a ding-dong struggle all the way. Cork tried the utmost, I'd say, in the last 7 or 8 minutes to look for that score, which didn't come, which I'd say they were in very hard luck.
What about the 47 final then against Cork?
Much the same, I mean, trying all the way, couldn't get there, just hard luck again on Cork, I would say.
What was your most enjoyable game?
I would say at 39, it was my first senior All-Ireland, and it was something to be always looking forward to, and just when the match was over, you couldn't believe you had won.
Jim, what is your opinion of the standard of hurling generally in Ireland today?
Well, I'd say the standard of hurling is as good as it ever was, but I'd say there's not as many playing it. Down in Kilkenny, you know, it's mostly the lift and strike business, and that's still the way. That's still the way they're going to play their game.
Is a hurler born or made?
I'd say he's born.
And is that why we don't have hurling in some parts of the country at all?
Well, it probably is. And then, of course, a lot of the country is all football, and they're going well in football. They forget about the hurlers. And I would say that if they took a little more interest in a lot of the county boards took a little more interest in their hurlers, they'd make it the grade as well as any other county.
You obviously would consider hurling a far better game than football.
A much faster game.
And a more skillful game?
Or more skillful.
What about the great players you've seen in your day and played against and played with, perhaps?
Well, of course we do. We had great players here. Paddy Phelan, Laurie Maher, the Burdens, the Larkins. I could go on forever mentioning them, but there's one man always sticks out in my memory, and he's not a Kilkenny man at all. It's Mick Mackey of Limerick. He was a wonderful player. He put up with an awful lot of heart, but took it all in the best of spirits, and I'd say he was one of the best players I've ever seen play.
It was Liam Campbell talking to Jimmy Langton, and next we hear an archive interview with the great Mick Mackey. The interviewer is Jimmy McGee.
Mick Mackey, in 21 years of senior hurling, what gave you your greatest thrill?
Well, my greatest thrill was in winning the 1934 All-Ireland. It was the Jubilee year, and it was my first All-Ireland. We had been beaten in 33, so it was a great thrill to win 34 after a replay against Dublin.
Any great disappointments in your life in hurling?
Well, not really. We had a great run. We had good luck and bad luck, but I mean on the whole we had fairly good innings.
Why? Have you any theory about why this particular period was the golden era of Limerick hurling, and why has it gone down now?
Well, I suppose we got a great bunch together at the right time. They all seemed to come at the right time, and at that particular time the hurling was in all the counties in Munster and in Leinster. It was of a high standard. It wasn't easy to get out of Munster at that time. You were lucky to survive the first round.
Do you think that the youngsters of today haven't quite as much interest?
Oh, I don't think they have the same interest as we had anyhow.
Mick Mackey, many people said that in your heyday you used to get away with a little trick of running with the ball without actually playing it on the hurley on a solo run. Is this true or false?
You'll hear a lot of stories, but you may trick a referee once or twice, but you won't get away with it all the time.
Do I take it from that you're admitting you did it?
Oh, I did a bit of it, I suppose, all right.
About forwards, who would you like to play with in a forward line? If you could get your ideal forward line, any particular names you'd like to have in it?
I don't know, I suppose you'd have Ring anyway. Langton of Kilkenny. We had Johnny Power, he was in my time. Limerick. I don't know.
I know it's hard to think of.
It's hard to think of.
Undoubtedly to be a fellow called Mick Mackey in there in the middle of them too. Mick, how does hurling today compare with hurling in your day? Is it better or worse or just about the same?
Well, I'd say the standard was higher in our time. And even before our time, it seems in the 20s to the 30s and the 30s to the 40s, the standard was high and very high. Definitely high.
When did it start going down and why?
I think it started from about 1940. I couldn't say why. But went down, it started going in each county. And in the counties in general it started to go. It went in Limerick actually, definitely in 40. They were never able to get back into it right.
Mick, had you any regrets from the game? Did you ever get any knocks that you didn't really fancy?
I got a few strokes here and there, but the overall, no. I was very lucky.
And finally, Mick Mackey, a wish for the future. If you had a wish for the future in sport, what would it be?
Well, I'd like to see Limerick win an All-Ireland.
Well, that's to be decided this afternoon. We'll conclude with the subject which, from listening to many hours of material, the subject which Jack Lynch preferred to talk about more than politics, hurling. Here he is with Donegal Dooling on the All-Ireland final weekend of 1989, talking about a game which he loved.
What do you think, Jack Lynch, is it about hurling that makes people want to talk about it like we are now?
I suppose, well, number one, it's ingrained in us. It's the oldest game in Ireland. I believe, even though I'm not going to pretend that my judgment is objective, it's the greatest field game in the world. It goes back to mythological times. Cú Chulainn, whether he had a golden hurley and or a brass hurley, whatever it was, and a golden ball, I don't know. I wouldn't like to be playing with those myself, because you can't beat the ash. And then even that very phrase, the ash, the clash of the ash.
Clash of the ash.
You know, the hitting a ball overhead on the ground, or overhead and on the ground, and quick movement. And the fact that in the old days people were able to fashion their commands out of hedgerows and things like that. And
it's as close to nature as to
it's a totally indigenous game. And I hope it'll expand. It is great to see teams like Offaly, you know, again, Antrim coming up. I was at Croke Park there a few years ago in the juvenile competition, and I saw some teams from Derry doing very well. Galway, of course, weren't strong in my time, but I would really like to see Clare and Limerick and Galway coming back, and of course Wexford in hurling. They had a great.
Wexford brought a good deal to the game, didn't they?
Oh, they did indeed. Again, there was this wholesomeness and strength, and you know, there was a vigor, a vibrancy about the game in those days as well. Dynamism, absolutely. And for the boys of Wexford, that kind of thing, it stirs a fella's blood. I'm sure if I were from Wexford in those days,
it's hard for a county that has won a lot to be down for a long time, like Tip, 1971.
Yes, I was thinking as I was coming over in the car this morning. Is it 17 years?
71 anyway.
17, that's 18 years. Now most of the team were playing wouldn't for Tip tomorrow. I won't even remember Tip winning in All Ireland, and most of the lads, the 15 and 16-year-olds who would be in tenterhoof tomorrow, to be like history for them to hear about Tipperary winning All Ireland, because you know history becomes very attenuated when you're 15 or 16. I mean,
do you enjoy sitting in Croke Park?
I do. I enjoy it, and what's more, I can detach myself from the desire to get in and play, because I'm certainly not on Tomani and Glee. I know that the only reason I prefer to be in there would be if Cork were playing in a tense match, because the tension can wear off more easily on the pitch than on the sideline. But certainly I never had any desire to want to be in there, because I felt I could do better. I knew I wouldn't. On in years anyway, but I love going to see. I love watching the skills. I don't like some of the skills that are developing this tendency to catch the ball too frequently, and
the hand pass.
I'd allow only one hand pass outside in the course of play. A fellow who might be in trouble, hand pass to a man who's free. I'd oblige him to deliver the ball with his hurley, or with his boot for that matter. But I certainly would disallow any scores with the hand, because the forward, the goalkeeper and back have no chance.
And it's all about the come on anyway.
Come on, and there's nothing better than to see a fella flying, hitting. You might shorten the grip on the stick, shorten the stick with your grip, and tap it over the bar. But that's hurling. The other thing is only a handball.
Jack Lynch is remembered as one of the greatest hurlers. He captained the Cork hurling teams of 1939, 1940 and 1942, and was on the winning team, the All-Ireland winning team in 1941, 42, 43, 44 and 1946. Did he miss out in 1945? Well, yes, but to compensate, he was a winner that year of an All-Ireland Gaelic football medal with Cork. And before he died, Jack Lynch made a donation to the GAA Museum of his hurling memorabilia. Con Murphy, his old teammate, was invited to that private dinner.
Well, as everybody knows, Jack went on to an eminent career at the bar as a lawyer, and of course became the highly respected politician that he was for many years in our country. The one thing that I always feel saddened about, and I'm sure many other people did as well, is that he hadn't the opportunity for long to enjoy the fruits of his labour and his career at the end of his time, when his health broke down a little. But he still was a man of great courage, never allowed his health to interfere with his normal living if he could manage it. And one of the really grateful memories I have of Jack is in that situation, in failing health, he decided to hand over all his wonderful trophies and which portrayed the history of his achievements to the GAA National Museum in Parker Croaky. And Maureen, his good wife, who we always must regard as so supportive of him and so helpful to him during his career, and particularly during his illness, invited Liam O'Milvahill, the Archsteward of Cumanlow Clascail, a great Glenrose man, Liam O'Tuma, and myself to his home in Dublin for the official handing over of his trophies to the National Museum. And as he handed over that wonderful array of trophies, it will always live with me. I never saw Jack emotional in his life, despite having known him for 40 years or more, until that occasion. And I will always remember his final remarks, which were rather conclusive, I suppose, to a great career and the lifetime of a great man. He said to Liam O'Milvahill as he handed over the trophy, "Take good care of them," he said. "They were hard."
We turn next to a politician, the 90th anniversary of whose birth falls next week, Jack Lynch. Twice Taoiseach, the third leader of Fianna Fáil and the last leader of the party to win an overall majority, and that was 30 years ago in the 1977 election. Before his political career blossomed, and we'll be dealing with his political career next week, he had been an outstanding sportsman, representing his native Cork, winning a record 6 All-Ireland medals in succession, 5 in hurling and 1 in football.
Well, we weren't well off. My father was a tailor, and he did a lot of what they call merchant tailoring in his own right, but he had a job as well. My mother used to help him out. She was what they call, I suppose, a seamstress in those days. And by standards around the place, around the Shandon area, Shandon Street, we were pretty well off, even though that was only the main income. My mother's income was very much supplementary. But we had a happy childhood. We had a lot of close friends naturally around the area. We had cousins living within a stone's throw, O'Donoghue's, and all our neighbours were very close. There seemed to be, as far as I know, there was never any bickering. And then, being close to Shandon, we were living near the little nucleus of a Protestant community there, because we had the old school, the national school was there, Bob and Jones they call it, the teachers, the named the Batemans, the sexton there it is, and behind them was old Skiddy's home, which is a geriatric place endowed by a former wealthy Cork person named Skiddy.
Jack Lynch grew up in Cork City, within earshot of the bells of Shandon.
Well, I was born in Shandon, just beside Shandon Steeple in Cork, and there was a lane running down beside Shandon, through the graveyard, and it was a quiet way because there were steps at one end, about 30 or 40 steps, so there was no through traffic. So we were able to play games, and it was mainly hurling up and down. It was only more, probably 20 feet wide and probably about 60 feet long up and down that way. And so I had 3 elder brothers, each of whom played hurling. Theo, my eldest brother, played with Glenrover Seniors. Charlie, who were both since dead, played with Farron Ferris in college, and Finbarg was my next eldest, and he played with me in the North Monastery, so the hurling was in the family. Of course, my father was from Bantry, so he hadn't much knowledge of hurling, but naturally he became interested. But when he came to Cork, he played with an old Cork team, now defunct, Gaelic football, Nil Desperandum, known as the Nils. So, and then my father, also being a Bantry man, used to go bowling up around Fairhill, and brought a couple of us up to make sure he wouldn't lose his bowls.
So you had the whole...
So we had a whole gamut and then, of course, going to North Monastery. There's nothing else you could do but play hurling in the North Monastery.
Do you think the brothers were important to hurling?
Oh, they were. They were tremendously important. We had some great mentors in the North Mon. Brother Lawler, who died later, I think, in Argentina. Brother Malone, Brother O'Brien, Brother McConville, Brother Moynihan, all dead now. But they were men of tremendous interest. And, of course, being brothers, they could stay back after school every day. And we had a little field just between the brothers' residence and the secondary school. It wasn't a very good field, but it was handy for hurling and knocking a ball around and for jumping around. And then, of course, being in the what might you call the catchment area of Glen Rovers, it was inevitable.
How did they approach skills? Did they try to teach you these?
No, indeed, except, no, I think, I don't ever remember any of the brothers teaching us any skills, except Brother Malone. He was a Limerick man, and his motto was pull soon and pull fast. That was keep the ball moving, and there's no use in pulling when the ball is gone. But otherwise, I think, well, I suppose the skills were inherent in most of the youngsters in school in my day.
He first became famous as a sportsman, and he played both Gaelic codes, football, but especially hurling.
Cork had a lean period, as you probably know, since 1931, the day of the year of the three finals. Cork won on the secondary play against Kilkenny. So in between, we had a very lean period. We beat a good Limerick team in the Munster final, 1939, and we were straight into the final from then, because there was no other match. I think Galway were playing against Kilkenny in the semi-final. So we went straight into the final. We thought we had a good team and we had every hope of winning it, but it wasn't to be. They won by the traditional point.
And were you captain on that day?
Yes, I was captain that day, so it was in effect a double disappointment to me, because in Cork, as in other counties, the county champions usually provide the captain if they have a man on the team, and Glen Rovers had several on that team, and I happened to be captain of Glen Rovers at that time.
It was also, of course, the time when a world war was breaking out all over.
Yes, indeed, although we weren't really conscious of the war clouds, and we had read vaguely about Hitler's invasion of Poland, and we had naturally been hearing the news and de Valera's voice coming over and warning about, that times were getting very dangerous.
You know from the news bulletins to which you have been listening that the great European powers are again at war.
But the actual day war broke out, we weren't really conscious of it, because it was Chamberlain declared war. We hadn't heard his radio broadcast.
I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
And I suppose it's all cynical to say it now, but it seemed to be a secondary consideration to us at the time.
You were trying to beat Kilkenny at the time.
Trying to beat Kilkenny, and it had another significance that day too, because they called it the Thunder and Lightning final, because we had all elements that day. In the morning it was lashing rain. We were staying out in the Salt Hill Hotel outside of Dublin, which was a new departure, trying to get the team away from the crowds. Then we went to Mass out in Monkstown, and it was really lashing rain. Then it cleared up, and we went into Cork Park for a beautiful day. Again, the heavens opened. We had every kind of weather. As far as I remember, we almost had sleet, I think, that day. We certainly had thunder and lightning.
And Kilkenny had the 1 point.
The 1 point scored by a man named Jimmy Kelly in the last minute. The ball was poked out after that, and that was the end.
Where were you playing on that team?
I was right half forward. Jack Barrett from Kinsale and Sonny Buckley, or Connie Buckley from the Glen, were midfield. I was marking one of the best players of all time that day, Paddy Phelan. He was left half back for Kilkenny, so it was a double baptism in fire from the heavens from Paddy Phelan's hurling and Kilkenny's skills. So we certainly remember the day, especially having been beaten.
What did it feel like being captain of Cork for the first time?
Well, I regarded it as naturally an honour, but somehow in Gaelic games, in my time anyway, it was only really the man who tossed the coin. We had really no influence on the field, and I often regretted that I didn't have more influence, because I felt that the man inside in the maelstrom of what was going on was a better judge of what was happening than the people on the sideline. And there were times that I regretted that I had no authority, because I could have changed the team. I believe now we might have won one or two more All-Irelands. But apart from the fact that you were there to toss the coin, your name was captain on the team, and if you won, you received the cup.
That was it?
That was it, yes.
Now, who spoke up for the Cork team?
Well, the famous Jim Tough Barry was our trainer that time, and he had been training Cork teams since the mid-20s. And I think he claims he had trained more All-Ireland hurling champions than anybody else. And no, I think his claim was more All-Ireland champions, because not only did he train Cork, but also Limerick when they were in the All-Ireland finals, and he trained some of the Cork Camogie teams. So Jim chalked up about maybe 12 or 15 All-Ireland titles. And I think he was also trainer of a Cork football team.
Was he good?
He was a most dedicated man. He was a merchant tailor,
his wife was ill and they had no family, so his whole life was devoted to hurling and training the team. In the old days, when the Cork hurlers were, many of them employed in Fords, and some of them, in these days again I should say that Ford was around the clock shift operation, and anybody who happened to be on a shift that didn't suit training or the match, tough went on. He saw the boss, nobody else but the boss, and got his men off. Then he looked after the hurleys, bought the hurleys, weighted them and saw that they were proper cut and design and weight. He looked after the jerseys, made sure they were washed, and went down to the athletic grounds to make sure the grass was cut at the right height. And he did everything. He had
You don't meet his kind very often.
You don't indeed. But Tough Barry had a great belief in himself, because he regarded himself as a tenor, and he often gave a rendering. He would stay with sing with the Cala Rosa. He was a good swimmer. He claimed, I don't know if it's true, I think it is true, to have won the Lee mile swim, and he was a diver. So he was an all-round man, but he wasn't great in the playing of hurling himself, but he had a great influence over the teams.
Con Murphy, another legendary Cork player and great friend of Jack Lynch's, recalled those days in this archive interview, elsewhere in RTE Sound Archive.
Well, in those days now, as travel was difficult, you couldn't hire a car to travel more than 60 miles, and you have a special reason for it. And I think the records will prove how the crowds got to those matches in such numbers is really a mystery. But they got there mostly on bicycles in Munster, cycling from Friday until match time on Sunday and cycling back again, maybe by some possibly chancy means in the back of a lorry and so on and so forth, but they got there. And of course the trains were running as well, but the depend on the trains to get there in time with the type of fuel they were operating on was always a bit of a guesswork, but they got there, and there were sizable crowds at all those matches, no matter where they were.
There weren't country attractions, well, especially during the war years, and most of us had to travel by bike. It would be a great excuse in those days, of course, when, for example, you go to a match and we might bring a girl to a match, and you kind of say, well, of course, with the petrol situation, we have to use a bike. But we all went training night after night, cycling. Some of the distant fellows, like from Fermoy, Mitchelstown, Middleton, Con Murphy from the southeast, Jack Barrett from the southeast, came by car, but these are hired cars mainly. I don't think any member of our team owned a car.
On the occasion of his 75th birthday, Brian Farrell, broadcaster and political scientist, offered this assessment of Jack Lynch.
I think he was is an extraordinary phenomenon. I think the most striking thing that I heard said about Jack Lynch was said by another great Irish politician, and that was Sean Lemass. And Lemass at one stage said to me, he said, the people love Jack Lynch, but I wonder will they respect him? And that was the question in his mind in regard to whether or not this extraordinarily likeable man, he is that Irish expression, a decent man, that is Jack Lynch, top to bottom. But there's much more than that to him. Of course he was reluctant. He's not the first major Irish politician to have been reluctant. But I think those people, and they included colleagues of his own in the 1960s, who thought he was going to be a caretaker, and moreover a caretaker that they could get rid of pretty damn fast. They'd got the wrong measure of the wrong man. He learnt, I think, as much about politics in Croke Park, and more importantly in Thurles and in Cork, as he ever did in Dáil Éireann. I think one of the things he learnt was that you had to stand for yourself, but you also had to be a team player. He was extraordinarily good, I think, as a team player, both when he was a minister, serving originally under De Valera, then under Lemass, but also, I think, as Taoiseach, he had a great capacity to attract people to him, to gain their respect, as well as their affection.
Lynch biographer T.P. O'Mahony on that same occasion, talking to Joe Duffy.
Well, I have to admit to a very large bias, a great affection for Jack Lynch, and I speak not just as a Corkman, but as a Blackpool man, which of course, as you know, is the home of Glen Rovers and was the heart of Lynch's old constituency. So I was approached recently about another politician, and I said I wouldn't write a book because I said I simply do not admire and respect the individual concerned. And I think in Lynch's case, it was that fired me initially, and I still, of course, have that great affection for him. I think all that Brian has said is true. I think I'm reminded of something that happened, which I think is an indication of his innate modesty. There was a book launched in Cork called The 21 Greatest Hurlers of Our Time, and the outstanding omission was Jack Lynch, and he undertook to launch the book and spoke glowingly of the 21 players who had been included, and yet his own omission was the single most newsworthy item about that book. You know,
and
that's an indication of
he is
of
incredibly
modesty.
modest, because we
Yes.
were speaking to him during the week, and 75, so what, he said.
Yes, he never saw. I think initially, I wouldn't have gone ahead. I think because initially, after Dr. O'Donoghue would probably know more about this than I do, but we met him in Cork about 4 weeks after his resignation, and there was a lot of buzz at the time that he was going to do a book. And the man for whom both myself and Mary Kenny once worked, Tim Coogan, was being mentioned as a possible ghostwriter, and big sums of money were being talked about. Some of the big London publishers were reckoned to be interested. And we met him in Cork, and I think it was his first sort of press conference since his resignation, and he simply, he dismissed the idea. He said he didn't see himself as an historical figure, was the phrase he actually used, and he couldn't understand why we were angry with him when he revealed that he hadn't kept a diary, he didn't keep any state papers, he had no notes, and we couldn't understand this. And he said, well, why should I keep them? I mean, to whom would they be of interest?
And next, here is Jack Lynch talking about hurling greats. Christy Ring.
Ring had a great brain like that. He was a man of great intellect, unfortunately not very much education, but I never saw a sharper brain in my life off the field, not necessarily on the field. So I'd say if he had a chance of education, he could have got very far in business life as well as in his sporting life.
Did you like hurling with him?
I did. I was lucky in that I never had to play against him, because he played with Glen Rovers, with Cork, and the occasions I played with Munster, so I never played against him. But I came up against him in training, and he was very hard. He was only, what I say in the song, although he's middling small, he's the daddy of them all. But he's about 5'9", I suppose. But every muscle and bone was hard in him, and his hands, I never saw bigger hands in my life. If I put my two hands together, well, they'd be about 1/3 of one hand over the surface of another. That would be about the size of Christy Ring's hands. And his wrists, of course, are powerful.
He had utter belief in himself, had he?
Absolutely. And I think more than anything else, Ring believed, first of all, that hurling was the only thing that was worthwhile, and that there was nobody able to beat him in hurling.
Earlier this year, before the All-Ireland hurling final, we covered the legendary Cork hurler Christy Ring. So briefly here to mark Tim Horgan's recent biography of Christy Ring, Jack Lynch on Ring when he died.
As long as young men will match their hurling skills against each other on Ireland's green fields, as long as young boys swing their commands for the sheer thrill of the feel and the tingle in their fingers of the impact of ash on leather, as long as hurling is played, the story of Christy Ring will be told, and that will be forever. As long as the red jerseys of Cork, the blue of Munster, the green, black and gold of Glen Rovers, colours that Christy wore with such distinction, as long as we see these colours in manly combat, the memories of Christy's genius and prowess will come tumbling back in profusion. We will relish and savour these memories, for we'll hardly see their likes again. Ní bheidh I le héad an arís, ní bheidh a hádú an arís, agus guim rat dé anam, labba I measc míomh na héireann go raibh